So welcome to another video. In this one, I just want to go over what history actually is and what it isn't to some degree. I'll do this occasionally where I upload a PowerPoint that might be useful to teach you something that wasn't covered in the book that I think should have been covered. And so at this point, I just want to ask you guys what you think history is. And since we're doing an online video, I guess you can't really respond back to me all that easily. But so an old joke would be to circle this part and say his story, and that's what it was for an awful long time. It was the story of great white men, and that's just sort of what the profession became. In recent years, the past 20 and 30 and 40 years, that's really started to change, and there are a bunch of sub-disciplines in history. Things like women's history and African American history and cultural history or social history are all options to be specializations within the discipline. So that's kind of where the profession is headed and where it is and has been for a little while now. But maybe we should start by asking what is not history. History is not just facts and dates and numbers. That's what it was for an awful long time, just like it was for an awful long time the story of only rulers and kings and leaders. Excuse me. It is also not just the story of battles and wars. For a long time, that's what history was, and I think that's the sort of preconceived notion of what history is. It's not just that anymore. When the discipline was first being professionalized, that's what it was. It's not anymore. It's a lot more than that. Not to say that these things aren't important. We're going to go over a bunch of leaders. I don't want to, not many kings in this case, because there aren't that many kings in the 20th century left, or the 19th century either. Yeah, I guess there's some in the yeah, we'll go over some kings. But it's not just that, right? So we have to expand the scope of what we're thinking about here. I also want to ask you or let you guys know about these categories of finding history, and I might ask you this question on a test at some point. So be on the lookout for it. But in general, there are three major categories of history. The first one is oral history, and that is what it sounds like: events or stories passed down over time orally, written or spoken word. Spoken words are history. If you're trying to think of an example of this, one might be the slave narratives that were taken during the Depression. So slavery ends in the United States in 1865, but nobody really wrote down the story of slaves for an awful long time. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the government said, wow, these are some pretty interesting stories, and these former slaves who were children when they were slaves are getting pretty old, so we should probably write down their names. So those would be some they became the slave narratives. Also think maybe in this case for oral history of Native American history, because there isn't much in the way of written records for most natives until Europeans arrive. So their stories would be passed down orally, and oral histories are still being done today. They're still being taken today. So the oral history is the first major category of finding history. I think it's pretty important. There's also written history, and this is the one that maybe most of us are more familiar with. Written history is anything that's written down. It's recorded testimony, recorded facts from living witnesses. These would be narrative records, not to be confused with the slave narratives. That's oral history still. Memoirs or letters, court deeds or business transactions all constitute written histories, and that's what we might be most familiar with. Which leads us to our third major category is physical history, and this would be unwritten information from the past, derived through physical remains of past civilizations. You might think of burial grounds or arts and crafts. And I have an example here of on the picture on the right of kind of a cross between two types of history. It's anybody's guess what I would say, is this, anybody have a guess on what this is? You might say, oh, it looks like hieroglyphics. Would that be the Rosetta Stone? It's like, yes, Rosetta Stone is not only a language learning software, it was the key to learning hieroglyphics. So this is just one example of something that's got its physical remains, but is also written testimony on it. There are two concepts that we have to be aware of when we're looking for history, and one is teleology, a difficult to pronounce word, and that is the telling of history as a story or a natural progression of events that could have only happened one way. And that's something we want to avoid here. History could have happened a number of different ways. It happened the way it happens, and that's kind of how we go through it, but keep in mind that it could have happened a different way, not to get too far into counterfactual information, but a lot of different possibilities were possible. It just so happens that this is the way that it did happen. And the next sort of big one is Eurocentrism, and that's viewing the history of the world as through a European perspective, with this sort of implied belief that the European hemisphere, the European continent, excuse me, was destined to take over the world. We live with these concepts in our daily lives, but let's try not to do that in here. I like to come up with some examples here, and the first example I'll show you is this map. It's a little blurry and it looks upside down, but is it really? Because does it really matter? I mean, we're just on a planet floating in space. So if you flip the map upside down, that's still correct. It's just our Eurocentric perspective puts Europe top and center on most maps. But there's nothing wrong with this one, and we're probably going to go with the regular one through most of this. But you know, it's still acceptable is what I'm trying to say here. The next example here is this concept known as the Middle East. Well, it's only east of Europe, so why do we call it the Middle East? It's kind of this Eurocentric view of the Arabian world. I guess Arabian and elsewhere, Muslim world, because Arabia is pretty much just this peninsula right here. So the Middle East, I guess we tend to think of it as where Muslims live in large part. But the Middle East really, that idea encapsulates more than just close to Europe, east of Europe, because Muslims actually spread through most of Africa and Asia and even up into Northern Asia, almost to all the way into Europe. There is a large Muslim population in the Balkans region of Europe. So the Middle East, it's only Middle East to the Eurocentric perspective. I'm also embarrassed to admit that it took me an awful long time as a history major to figure out the difference between a primary and a secondary source, so I just want to go over that right off the bat here. A primary source, for the most part, is somebody who saw it, somebody who did it, somebody who made it. From the past, they wrote it, and it became a source. That's what makes it primary. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are things that people like me and you are writing about the past. So the example here, this is my first scholarly paper. I wrote about Thomas Jefferson and religion because why not? And I was using primary sources, stuff that he wrote, to write my paper, which made mine secondary using primary sources that Thomas Jefferson had wrote. So I think that if you're struggling to grasp the difference between primary and secondary stuff, and I might ask you this on a test later, let me know and we can talk about it more on the forums. And so I think that'll bring us to the end of this kind of what is history PowerPoint here. So if anybody has any questions, let us all know and we'll try and figure them out together. So thanks guys. I'm looking forward to a good semester again.